Welcome to Feeling Seen, the podcast that talks about the movies that make us feel seen. Today is a very exciting day because my co-host comes from the world of journalism, and the much-beloved film that we are discussing is The Devil Wears Prada, which is, in fact, a movie about journalism. I'll tell you more about my guest in a moment, but before we dive into it, I gotta say that this is the first episode of the 2024 Max Fun Drive. Woohoo! It goes through March 29th, 2024, and it is the best time of year to become a member by making a monthly pledge of support to this show and any others on the network that you might love. It's the best time because you can subscribe and get the most out of your pledge. That means not just the bonus content, which we'll get to more on later, and the great thank you gifts. We have goals set at this show, and if you help us hit those goals during the drive, cool stuff can happen. There's more about that later. We're going to keep teasing you. We're going to keep hooking you for later. But for now, just go to MaximumFun.org/join. And if you're already a supporter, thanks a lot. And now consider upgrading. Now, on with the show. My co-host, Susie Banikarim, has held such positions as the editorial director for Gizmodo, the head of global news for Vice, and she was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and is currently the co-host and EP of the new podcast, In Retrospect. Susie Banikarim, what else do the people need to know about you before we get started?
Oh my God, thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction.
I'm sorry, you've won an Emmy. You've also won an Emmy. We have to acknowledge the honors there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I have won actually a couple Emmys. I'm very proud of them. Although in television news, as I'm sure you know, it's like more common than in entertainment. So like in the news business, we're all like, it doesn't mean anything unless I win it. And then it means everything.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yep. It's just like, I don't do my job for that. And until you win, you're like, well, I haven't done my job before it, but I'm really glad I got this doing my job.
Yeah. It's just like a nice toy. And I do love having it. So what else do you need to know about me? I mean, I think the thing about me that becomes very obvious if you listen to our podcast, and I co-host it with Jessica Bennett, who's an editor at The Times, who's an old friend and just like an amazing person, is that it sounds from my resume like I'm a very serious person who wants to talk about very serious things. But in fact,
it kind of sounds like a bad bitch journalism resume. It does.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. But really what I want to talk about is like the Real Housewives. And like, I just want to talk about pop culture. I think I'm one of the only people who watches like every political debate and every, Real Housewives reunion. So, I think that's actually the most relevant thing to know about me, aside from my resume, which is that I just love everything to do with entertainment and pop culture and also true crime. Like, I love all of that stuff. So doing this show has been such a pleasure because I get to indulge that part of me.
Okay, so this is, saying, like I'm a devotee of culture and entertainment, and then we are two women with podcasts. I would believe in the like millennial Gen X zone, around that perhaps cusp.
Yes.
Your podcast, In Retrospect, like it's what it says on the tin. You're looking back at things for sort of like cultural reevaluation. That will get to the topic that we get to, which is why it's very relevant. But then like things like Axe body spray, Britney Spears, the effect of Baywatch on a generation of viewers kind of thing. We have your podcast. We have things like You Were Wrong About. I have my own personal endeavor little podcast I do with a filmmaker friend of mine that is all about reevaluating millennia era horror in the social and like political and anthropological context of the time, to be like, hey guys, here's the real value of these movies you missed. My question to you then, to start it off, is it that we just are the ones with microphones, us millennials, Gen Xers? Or is it like, is there a uniquely intricate toxicity to the culture we grew up in that has led us to this point where it's like, guys, we gotta look back at our formative texts to see how much we were screwed up by them? Is that special to us, or are we just the ones who got these platforms to talk about them so much? Because this cultural excavation and reappraisal is a part of my life's work as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a combination. To start with, I do think every generation thinks what they grew up on was probably, a mess. And You're Wrong About is obviously kind of the leader in the space, and I was a big fan of that show. But I think what Jess and I were trying to figure out when we started talking about doing this podcast, and Jess has really been on the forefront of a lot of this coverage. She did the first big Monica Lewinsky piece when Monica Lewinsky was being reevaluated. She was the first ever gender editor at the time. So she's really been thinking deeply about these issues. And I think the thing we wanted to do, which it sounds like is similar to what you're doing with the horror podcast, is these are things we loved. I don't think we're just looking back to say, oh, these are toxic, these are terrible, these are things you should reject or, refuse to watch anymore or consume. What we're trying to do is look at these things that we loved and see if there are things to take away that are good and bad. There's always a lot of bad.
That is exactly what we are doing.
That's just the reality. Yes. Yeah. But I think, every generation probably looks back at the sort of entertainment they were fed and asks questions about what that taught them. But I think we do ask more questions generationally, maybe, because we're in this period where history is being constantly reevaluated, right? Where we're asking a lot of these questions, and those questions are in the zeitgeist. So I think it's probably a combination of both things. We're the ones with the microphones, but also, we are like really interested in these topics in a way that maybe generations before us weren't as much, even though they probably did get really screwed up entertainment. I mean, think about Leave It to Beaver, right? The generation that grew up on that must have been really confused about what it meant to be a family, we were really the first ones who started to see that we could respond to things. We think a lot on our show about what would have happened if there was social media at the time of the events we cover or the shows we cover, because the conversations would have been really different. And interestingly, one of the shows we did was about General Hospital. I don't know if you know anything about General Hospital, but
we were a not a General Hospital household at my babysitter where I would watch soap operas. But yeah, definitely was in soap culture when that was still a thing.
Right. So I was also not a General Hospital fan. I was a Days of Our Lives, One Life to Live girl.
One Life to Live, One Life to Live, the Buchanans in Landview, absolutely.
Of course, yeah, amazing storytelling. So I, did an episode about that because I had discovered somehow along the way that this thing that I was very aware of, even though I didn't watch General Hospital, which was the marriage of Luke and Laura.
Luke and Laura. Even I know Luke and Laura. Yeah.
Right. It was this huge television event. 30 million people watched it live. I mean, it just is intense thing. That relationship started on the show as an explicit storyline about Luke raping Laura, right? And we did that episode because we were like, wait a minute, what message did this send girls? Because the show explicitly decided to make it a seduction. They actually literally sort of slowly over time changed the story. And then years later, they had to go back and tackle it and be like, actually, we acknowledge this was a rape. But the reason I bring it up is that soap operas were actually the only medium at that time that were getting immediate feedback like social media, because they got daily overnight ratings. So they could see what was responding with the audience. And so to me, that is like really fascinating, because now if you're producing a show or you're making something, you're getting immediate feedback all the time. But back then it was really soap operas that had that kind of immediate feedback loop. And they saw that Luke was really popular, and that's why they turned it into a seduction. He was supposed to die after 3 weeks. Wow. So isn't that so interesting how much actually having a feedback loop changes the art we make as well? Like, I think that's so interesting. So there is sort of something fascinating about people who are putting things into the world now, knowing that there's this sort of watchful eye, which maybe does make them slightly less wild.
I feel like on a subconscious level, like at the very least on a subconscious level, there has to be an effect. Like that's too gargantuan of a conceit to not.
I mean, we think about it on the show. Sometimes Jess jokes like, "Oh, are we going to get canceled?" I mean, of course, it's just in the back of your mind. You're like, "Oh, of course, at any moment." Like who knows what could happen. And I think that's like one of the vulnerabilities of doing this kind of work. You just put yourself out there and you hope for the best, and you hope you don't accidentally say something really stupid.
You invoking her mentioning cancellation actually brings me perfectly to the topic, because I listened to the episode of your show that you did on the very movie we are going to discuss today.
Amazing.
Where Jess says something about, like, well, okay, cancel me. Like, sorry for this take.
Yes.
So please tell us the movie and the character that you have brought to discuss today.
Okay, so I have brought Devil Wears Prada, The Devil Wears Prada, which, as many people know, started as a book about Anna Wintour, but was fictionalized as a famous fashion editor named Miranda Priestley. And her protege in the movie is an assistant named Andy. And so I have cheated a little bit because I have brought two characters. I have brought Andy as the character who I initially really related to in this movie. And I also want to talk about Miranda, who is sort of who I came to identify with in some ways, and who I've learned a lot about in terms of the way they developed the character for the movie. So I think she's an interesting character. And as I've gotten older and taken on leadership roles, I have thought about her in a really different way.
My name is Andy Sachs. I recently graduated from Northwestern University.
And what are you doing here?
Well, I think I could do a good job as your assistant. And, I came to New York to be a journalist and sent letters out everywhere, and then finally got a call from Elias Clark and met with Sherry up at Human Resources, and basically it's this or Auto Universe.
So you don't read Runway?
No?
And before today, you had never heard of me?
No.
And you have no style or sense of fashion?
Well, I think that depends on what you're...
No. That wasn't a question.
I mean, touching on being a millennial Gen Xer, this is an essential text. And talk about a movie that, like, I'm glad it didn't come out when we were all on Twitter talking about things, when Twitter was really good. But I do wish I could look into the crystal ball universe in which this Twitter was thriving at the time when this movie came out, just to see how the reactions would have been, because this is a fascinating movie, I feel like, specifically to experience over time. Because I feel like when it came out, there was, like, this sort of knee-jerk, for the most part, like, populist reaction of, like, oh, Miranda, that bitch, and, like, go Andy. But then definitely as I've watched it more over time, I'm like, well, Miranda is a bitch,
but complicated.
That's not all we have to say about her. And also, this is definitely a movie about an idiot 22-year-old who's just come out of Northwestern and is like an asshole from Medill. And her friends are very uncharitable in how she, like, her friends who should all be working as much as she is because they're 20-somethings in New York. Her boyfriend who, why are you home? You work at a restaurant. You should never be home. Like,
I know. I was very confused by that. I'm like, why is he home ever at night? Like, shouldn't he be on the night shift every single night?
Yeah, you should be closing. Like, what is, you should be home, like, making $50 grilled cheese.
I make port wine reductions all day. I'm not exactly in the Peace Corps. You know, I wouldn't care if you were out there pole dancing all night, as long as you did it with a little integrity. You used to say this was just a job. You used to make fun of the runway girls. What happened? Now you've become one of them.
That's absurd.
Hey, that's okay. That's fine. Just own up to it. And then we can stop pretending like we have anything in common anymore.
But so it is fascinating to the experience of growing up with The Devil Wears Prada. This movie, I think, becomes a different movie in a very specific way over time.
I totally agree with this because I think it's natural. You know, I saw this movie when I was starting out essentially in journalism. I had been a journalist for 3 years. And I agree. I think if Twitter, real Twitter, had existed when this movie came out, it would have been a big topic of conversation because, you know, journalists love to talk about themselves. So I think in general, there would have been this real reaction. And
it's like how Hollywood loves to give Oscars to movies about Hollywood because
100%.
Yes. And I love a journalism drama. It's the best drama there is.
Me too. Love it. I could just spend all day. So I think what's sort of interesting is, of course you identify with Andy if you are young when you see this movie. You are also starting out. You have these kind of demanding bosses. you struggle with these same issues in your interpersonal relationships. And I think one thing that's really funny is that when the movie came out, it was sort of like peak Adrian Grenier.
Yes.
Era. So he was like considered so hot and cool when it came out. And now online people are like, that boyfriend was the worst. He's like such a jerk. And I think that's like
Nate
a funny
sucks.
reevaluation. Yeah, Nate sucks. There's like all these memes about him. And like he's been interviewed about it, which I think is so funny, and been like, yeah, I guess I wasn't like the best. It's just like, I'm like, he's like a character. Like you weren't actually that guy. But you know, as a journalist, of course, like initially you relate to her, right? Because that is, you know, maybe not entirely, because I wasn't as self-serious as her. I never thought I was going to go work at the New Yorker. Like I knew I wanted to work in television. So not in every way, but I thought, oh, you know, she is really like struggling to find herself in this context. Like I related to her. But over time, you start to realize that what it actually takes to be a Miranda, whether or not that's what you want, which I think, you know, I have come to reevaluate in a lot of ways, does take an enormous amount of work and effort. Like you do not just become Miranda Priestley, or if we're just being honest about the case, Anna Wintour. Like you do not become the very best at something by being really chill and cool. You know, it's like that's just a contradiction. And by the way, we don't expect that of men. We don't expect men who are super successful to be chill and cool. Nobody talks about Steve Jobs and talks about how chill and cool he was. They talk about how demanding he was, how intense he was, how meticulous he was. And so over time, I've come to realize that this portrayal of Miranda is actually, you know, sort of unfair, because what do we expect of our women leaders? What do we want from them? Like either they are allowed to be just like men, and that's not great because men aren't great, but at least we acknowledge that they are like doing the work, or we want them to be like sweet and soft and kind, but then they would never get to those positions. Like I don't want to be the head of content at Condé Nast, but I don't think being sweet and cuddly would get you there. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't
particularly, I don't think it would get you there generally, but it certainly would not have gotten you there in the arc of time that Anna Wintour's career has existed in.
Yes.
Those phases
I think that's
of feminism
100% true.
Were not, like, those were not, I mean, even pre-girl bossery, that, like, what a fascinating life, like you talked about on your Devil Wears Prada episode, that term has had. Like, the CEOs most aligned with the term girl boss, like, the, you know, they, like, flamed out famously, and surely those stories are more nuanced than the public narratives allowed us to know, but at the same time, like, the like I think Anna Wintour became the editor-in-chief of Vogue in the late 1980s.
Yes.
That was
I think maybe even early 1980s. I mean, she's been in that job for longer than many, many people listening to this podcast have been alive. And I think it's actually a really good point that I've just developed a lot more empathy over time. When you're like 22 or 23, you don't have as much empathy for the women who came before you. But the reality is the Anna Wintours kicked open doors we got to walk through, you know, and they got to do it in a time where it was really, really difficult. And so I've had these really difficult female bosses. And as I've become more senior, I've become more empathetic to them, right? Like, even though I have worked really hard not to be that kind of boss, as I have taken on leadership positions, I've been like, wow, it is so hard to do this in this era. I can't even imagine what it was like to do it in that era, right? Where you were the only woman at the table often. You were, you know, constantly sort of being treated in this kind of like double standard. So I just really feel for Miranda when I watch the movie now in a way that I just didn't the first time. In the way that, like, the first time I watched it, I was like, this woman is crazy, you know? And like, but I think what's also interesting, which you listen to the episode, so you know this, is that in fact, the book was very clear about Miranda being the villain, but that the filmmaker made a very conscious decision to not make her the villain of the piece in the film, because he felt that really the arc of the film is that Andy is coming of age, and part of what she's realizing is that she may reject Miranda, but ultimately those decisions Miranda's made are also what's made her successful. And I think that's like a really interesting nuance that the film, gets across, but maybe a lot of people didn't pick up on the first time, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like in rewatching.
Well, yeah, and in the 2000s, we didn't want to pick up on that shit. Like, in the 2000s, I think there was a lot less clearance for us wanting to empathize with a woman in that way in popular media.
Yes. Yeah, because women's characters in general, we talk about this on In Retrospect all the time, are really flattened. We like to make women really like simplistic cardboard cutouts. Like, this woman is bad, or this woman is a slut, or this woman is good, and she's an angel. But people are complicated and nuanced, and they're not all good, and they're not all bad. And women leaders especially, I think, really struggle with that. The girl boss thing is a perfect example of that, where, they developed these brands in opposition to men, and then they fell into some of those same traps because women aren't perfect. They're not, they make mistakes. And it shouldn't be used to undermine the concept of female leadership, but it has in many ways when it comes to the girl boss thing. And I want to be clear, I should say this. I'm not like condoning being a shitty boss. I'm not saying that people should be toxic, terrible people. Yeah. I'm in no way condoning that. I'm just saying that it is more complicated than just like, this is bad and this is good. Because being a good boss takes constant vigilance and effort. Like, it really is hard.
Being a good manager takes constant effort and attention and care to be better at it.
Yes. And by the way, sometimes you screw up. Like, I have really, really tried to be the kind of boss I wish I had coming up. But I am sure there are people, and please don't email me if you are one of them, who would not agree that I have succeeded. I'm sure there are plenty of people who don't think I have, always hit it out of the park. And that's okay, I think. I think that's just part of being human and learning and growing. And hopefully I've gotten better over time. And also, I think I don't know how much I want to be in those positions anymore. Like, I've done it and it was hard. And now I think the shape of my ambitions have changed as well. So I think that's kind of a different part of the story as well. Like, I think watching that movie and realizing becoming Miranda is not necessarily all it's cut out to be is sort of part of the complication.
Well, and okay, I'm going to get to the ambition aspect there too. But first, I want to bring up when I was listening to your episode about this on your show and, researching for the conversation, I remembered, like, because there's, you mentioned famously, one cannot talk about the Double Rose Potter without mentioning the cerulean sweater speech.
The cerulean sweater.
A definitive monologue in cinema history. In a career as vast as Meryl's, one of perhaps her definitive monologue.
One of her definitive monologues for sure. And every time I see that color mentioned in any context, I immediately think about The Devil Wears Prada. Like, that color is forever associated with that movie.
Absolutely.
You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that sweater is not just blue, it's not turquoise, it's not lapis, it's actually cerulean. And you're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns. And then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets? I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room.
Andy coming in being like, this isn't real. I want to be a real journalist. And I hear that if I get a year on this desk with Miranda, I can come out and get any job I want. Like, that will propel me into doing real serious journalism, and I can get out of this fluffy place that doesn't contribute valuably to the culture in any way. And she is set straight on that notion over time. Part of Andy's arc is realizing that, like, okay, I guess I was a pretty, like, entitled little dick when I got here.
Yeah.
That's not, like, the meat of the movie, but, like, I watch it now.
No,
and I
it's
choose to
definitely
believe
part
that's
of the movie.
key,
Yeah.
arc, and when she starts, like, taking it seriously. But, like, there is that thinking of that reminded me that in the Anna Wintour documentary, the September issue, 2 parts I remember most vividly from that. There's a person who gets one edit in that whole documentary, one line for however long they were interviewed, where they're just saying, September is the January of fashion. And I don't know what that means, but they say it so fabulously. It's incredible. And then there's another scene where I swear to God, I didn't just, like, make this up in my mind. B. Schaefer, Anna's daughter, is being interviewed, and she's talking about how she doesn't want to follow in her mother's footsteps because she wants to pursue something more serious.
Oh, it's so interesting.
I really don't want to work in fashion. It's just not for me. I really respect her, obviously. But it's a really weird industry to me, and it's just not for me. She wants me to be an editor. I don't want to put it down, but I would never want to take it too seriously. Some of the people in there act like fashion is life, and it's really amusing, and you can make fun of them, but for that to be your career, it's just like, there are other things out there, I think.
The way she effectively, in a documentary about the scope of her mother's impact on culture and accomplishment, she manages to admonish the seriousness of the work that she does. Yes. And I was like, damn, that is Andy right there.
Yeah.
Like, this is intense. The call is coming from inside the house. So, like,
such a great point.
Talking about it in the context of this conversation of reevaluating this movie over time, I was like, damn, like, even Anna's own kid in a people haven't made a documentary about me. Like, her own child in a documentary about her tenure, her reign, and effect on global fashion. Her daughter is like, I want to do a real job.
Right.
Whoa.
It's just funny. I mean, it's funny because I did watch it recently, and that scene didn't, like, impact me in the same way. But now that you mention it, it's so obvious what you're saying. It really is this sort of perfect encapsulation of what ends up being the storyline of Devil Wears Prada. And also, it's such an interesting thing about Anna Wintour is that she talks about in that film how she's sort of the black sheep of the family because she's considered the least serious. Mm-hmm. And it's just a fascinating
And have there been
thing.
more serious editorial figures of our time?
Like, it's really hard.
Serious is her brand in the popular imagination.
100%. And by the way, fashion journalism is real journalism. I don't feel like we need to say that, but I will, because I do think there are all these sort of little brats running around at journalism schools all across the country, denigrating that. But it's a real thing. And she's also more than just an editor. I think that's something people forget about her. Yeah. Yes, she's an incredibly successful editor, and that is impressive. But she is also just a force in the fashion industry, right? Mm-hmm. She decides who is and isn't going to succeed in many cases. Maybe not as much now as at one time, but she used to fundamentally be able to make or break a designer with just the tilt of an eye.
And for decades on end.
Impressive.
She had that power for decades on end.
Yeah, so I think it's easy to sort of dismiss her work as not serious, but it's wild to do it. And you're so right. Having her daughter do it must be so strange, right? It must be strange to watch this documentary about yourself and then have your daughter be like, ugh, eye roll. But it's funny. This actually reminds me that once I was working with Cokie Roberts years ago. I worked at ABC News. And she told me that famous people who don't have children are often really insufferable because it's your children that keep you humble.
Sure, yeah.
I really think that's true. I really think it's true that if you are in a position like that, so few people ever give you feedback that's not positive. So having a kid is probably pretty humbling, and having your daughter say on a documentary that your work is sort of silly must be a great example of that, right?
Truly.
I don't have kids, so I don't know, but I feel like I would not enjoy that.
You're like, I
If
don't
my
have kids,
dog
and as a
said
famous
that would be
person,
bad.
it does make me very insufferable. As a public figure, it makes me worse to be around.
Insufferable, yeah. I mean, I'm sure I'm a terrible person, but I don't think it's because I don't have kids.
It is time for a quick break, but I will be right back with Susie and a lot more talk about The Devil Wears Prada. Now, Max Fun Drive is the one time of year when we all at this network come together to invite you to support the show as a member by boosting or upgrading your existing membership. Again, thank you if you're already here. Max Fun membership pays for the shows, and you get to choose who gets your contributions. We are supporter, subscriber, listener funded, which means you pick the shows you want to support, you give us your dollars, and we can keep making these great programs for you. You guys don't want us being governed by corporate overlords. Maximum Fun is an independent podcasting operation, and it's also worker-owned and operated, which is a really cool way to keep complete creative control for ourselves while we bring you the shows and forge these wonderful host-listener relationships that you put in your ears every week, hopefully every day. So how do you become a part of this incredible ecosystem of maker and listener joined together in harmony to create elite podcasts? You can join. You can come aboard the Good Ship Maximum Fun for the first time, become a donating member, pick a show, pick this show, Feeling Seen, that's us. You can upgrade, or you can boost your membership. There are various ways you can get involved here, and we make it so easy for you, so why not come on over? And when you get here, guess what? It's not just the stuff that is out there on the main feeds that you get access to. There is also bonus content. Max Fun has a library full of special bonus episodes and content you can enjoy from all your favorite Max Fun shows. And this network's been around for a while, so that is a pretty big library of additional programming for you to listen to. We are excited for you to enjoy this year's bonus content from us. You might, if you're a Feeling Seen listener, know that erotic thrillers come up in this conversation a lot, like in various conversations, even ones where they don't really belong. But it's a hobby, it's a passion, it's a pastime. So we have decided that if we get a sufficient number of new members to join Feeling Seen, we are going to do dedicated members-only bonus content where we will deep dive into another erotic thriller with a different guest. There's already an episode on deck where me and the producer Marissa go long on the incomprehensible erotic thriller Color of Night, starring Bruce Willis. And you have to listen to the bonus content about it, because like you could write about this movie, but then you would miss people's like sighs and gasps of shock and delight. It's an experience to talk about The Color of Night. And we want to share that experience with you. So look, we're already offering you treats. So come join us at the table and you can have access to the whole buffet of them across the network. So will you please join us as a member? I'm asking you here, I'm looking you in the eye, clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. Will you become a Max Fun member? And you want to say, how am I supposed to do that? Because you don't know already. You go to MaximumFun.org/join. That's it. That's all you got to do. All right, now let's get back to my conversation with Susie Banikarim. Well, I wanted to talk to you about the sense of like the points of identification with Andy in early watches of this film. Like, where does, like you mentioned, ambition and how that's realigned in your life, where does that sense of ambition connect with young you and like earlier you and watching Andy in like first rounds with this movie?
Well, I think young me was just like incredibly hungry, right? Like I didn't just want to work. I needed to work. Like I needed money, right? Like I didn't have a safety net. I didn't come from the kind of situation where I could like fall back on my parents if things didn't work out for me. So I was just like really intense. I was willing to do whatever it took. And I did feel really lucky to be in these jobs, right? I started out as a management consultant, not as a journalist. And I remember just like working every weekend and working late at night. And that was expected of us. And I did not question that in a way that I feel like is probably unhealthy, right? But so I actually really related to her falling into that trap of wanting so desperately to please. Because I think when I was coming up, I desperately wanted to please the people who I worked for. And that's really natural when you're young, but I think a lot less common. And I have to say, I really admire like a lot of the Gen Z women that I work with, you know, because they just do not have any interest in putting up with the shit that I thought was just totally normal behavior.
Yeah.
You know, like I was like, this is what it takes to succeed. I have to put up with all of this toxic bullshit. And they're like, no, actually, you don't. You don't actually have to do that. And I really have like learned a lot from seeing them stand up for themselves. And I love that. That's been really like liberating for me to be like, oh, I actually did not need to put up with so much to get to a place of power. Like I could have had more self-respect. I mean, if I'm just being honest, like there are just so many things I was willing to do because I was told that I had to do it. So I think that's what I always really related to in the film, even though her friends were giving her a hard time and it wasn't, you know, presented as this positive thing. I also felt like I had to do everything that was asked of me. And, you know, I don't know that that was good in general, right? That's how we got a lot of things beyond just toxic bosses. We got, you know, abusive bosses. We got sexually abusive bosses. So I think that shift in the culture has been really healthy. And, you know, it also sort of puts into context that Miranda is mean at times, but she's not abusive.
She doesn't get it. No, I could call frickin' J.K. Rowling or I'm not gonna get a copy of that book.
My girls are leaving on the train for their grandmother's at 4, so the book better be here no later than 3.
Of course.
And I would like my steak here in 15 minutes.
No problem. Okay. I have 4 hours to get the impossible manuscript. Smith & Wollensky's doesn't open until 11:30. How am I gonna get the steak? Okay. I will be back in 15 minutes. Wish me luck.
No, shan't.
That is an interesting thing about, like, with the unmasking of what truly, and, like, it happens in every industry, not just Hollywood, but because there are so many eyes on Hollywood, it has become the sort of public face of an equity movement, you know, instigated by Me Too, you know, in a popular form. And so, like, the putting, like, the outing of some figures as, like, this is how bad it can be is, like, I mean, Miranda wants the same steak every day from not the company kitchen.
Yeah, right.
She's picky and can be unreasonable. But damn, mostly what Andy is asked to do in this movie is her job.
Yeah, that's actually kind of the thing, right? When you first see it, you don't really think about it that way because you're like, these are such unreasonable demands.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know what it was like for you coming up in journalism, but I came up in TV journalism, which was really rough and tumble. Like
That
I had
must
people
have been.
throw things at me. You know what I mean? Like I had people
that's
put their
abuse.
hands on me, you know? So it's like, I have seen so much worse now than what was presented in that movie. And I'm not defending any of that. Like I really resent having
that's
people
not
put their
the
hands
way.
on me. Like I really wish no one had ever thrown anything at me. I think I put up with some really intense tongue lashings that I'm sure gave me PTSD for years. But, you know, unreasonable and demanding is what a lot of successful people are.
Yeah.
And to present that as this sort of like monstrous thing actually speaks more to, I think, the woman who wrote the original book, right?
Oh,
because the
100%,
original book was written as a revenge fantasy. She worked for Anna Wintour. She quit, just like people quit their jobs. And then she wrote this takedown book, which in a lot of ways does speak to the same willingness to do whatever it takes to get ahead.
It
right?
certainly is not just sorting your issues out in therapy and sorting them out in a way that will enrich you in perhaps multiple ways.
Right. So it's like kind of ironic, right? She sort of like writes this book to be like, this person is so bad. She's so demanding and willing to do whatever it takes to succeed. It's like, but you are also willing to do whatever it takes to succeed. So the
Right.
sort of not being able to see yourself in these women who came before you, I think is a failing in some ways, right? We should at least acknowledge how much we are those women, but for, you know, the grace of God.
Yeah, there before the grace of God go I.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and you in having mentioned the ambition aspect earlier, and you talked on your podcast about, and I think it's meaningful to get into here, where like how the nature of ambition in your life possibly has changed, where it's like, you know, not perhaps about like the highest position or the biggest paycheck, but like
Yes.
you are not a person who lacks an ambition for your life, but it is reoriented itself. Its targets have rearranged as you've gotten older, and I wondered what kind of a catalyzing point that you may recognize for when you started to realign the sort of nature of ambition in your life.
It's so interesting because I think it kind of just happened gradually over time. So yeah, you know, for a long time I just worked because I needed to, right?
Yeah.
Like I was just like desperately trying to kind of get my head above water. Like I wanted to be a success because that's just, you know, like I was like a type A good student. Like I wanted to succeed. And then eventually, you know, I got into these positions and I felt really lucky to have them, but they were difficult. I mean, I think running newsrooms in this era is particularly difficult for a lot of reasons, right? Like the market conditions
Yeah.
aren't great. Being a journalist in this environment is difficult. And you're asking a lot of people, right? Like you're asking people to go out into the world in dangerous situations. And so sometimes that can feel really complicated. But I guess, and this feels like such a cliched answer, it really started to change for me during the pandemic because, you know, I was working at Vice when the pandemic happened. We were relaunching a show, Vice News Tonight. We relaunched a week before the shutdown started. And, you know, it was the most intense year I've ever had at work, right? I ran a morning meeting every day at 9 a.m. Our show aired at 11 p.m. So I would get up in the morning, prepare for the 9 a.m. meeting, stay on until 11:30 when the show finished airing.
Damn.
And then
Whoa.
sometimes get on a call with a correspondent who was out in the field in Italy covering the pandemic in, you know, somewhere where there were race riots. So it was this really difficult time, not just for me, but for the people who I was leading, right? I mean, they were really putting up with so much in their personal lives. Like we were all trying to just survive. And at the same time, they were doing this incredible work, like this incredibly meaningful, important work. Like I'm so proud of the work we did that year. But it really took a toll on me. And I just wasn't well at the end. You know, a year into that, I was just like, I was not physically that healthy. I was emotionally really spent. And I felt a lot of guilt about, you know, what I was and wasn't able to do for the newsroom. You know, I took some time off and I really thought about it. And I was like, you know, I really like managing people in a lot of ways. Like I like leading newsrooms. I like feeling like I'm creating an environment that people want to be in and an environment I wish I had been in. But I also don't know that I have that in me anymore in the same way. You know, and that feels hard to say because, you know, I think people expect you to just like keep doing like more and more and more and being more and more successful on paper. But I think the thing that I prioritize now is just like doing creative work I enjoy, working with people I like, and really doing it in a much smaller way. Like that has been really fulfilling for me. Maybe there will come a time and eventually like a financial reason to get back into sort of like, you know, a big newsroom and a big job. But I think like doing the work itself, like being closer to the work and less like just managing the thing to make other people, to make it possible
Air
for other
traffic
people to do
control,
the work.
kinda.
Yeah. Feels a lot more satisfying. And I think that's okay. You know, I mean, it definitely is interesting to see how other people react to it because it brings up things for other people, right? Like when you're like, hey, I don't know that I care that much anymore about being the most successful, objectively speaking, as I can be, that makes people question their own choices. And I think people really struggle with that on some level. They like really feel like the most important thing is like, how big a job can you get? How much money can you make? And I was on that track for a long time. So no shade. Like, I feel like people should do what they need to feel good about their careers. But it's definitely changed for me in ways that I think, I don't know, will ever entirely shift back to the way I was.
There's a kind of grieving specifically that comes with taking yourself off of a journalism track that you were on for a long time. It's like, am I letting down the part of myself that committed to journalism? Who am I if I'm not a journalist? Like, there's so much identity wrapped up in it and way of living, then I think there is a uniqueness to divesting from that sort of life compared to some other kinds of jobs. Not all, but just some other kinds of jobs.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't really thought about that, but it's a good point. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting about the transition I've had is that I actually feel closer to the journalism part of my job, like making a podcast where I'm getting to do research and writing and thinking about things that I would want to think about anyway, and sort of falling down all the rabbit holes that I fall down, just by virtue of being the kind of person who, like, my brain just sees something and then needs to know the next thing and the next thing. And then it'll be like 3 hours later. So in that sense, I think it is true that in some ways what I've done is kind of get closer to that. But there is definitely a certain sense, and I think this is what you were touching on, that, journalism is a calling, and one that is, increasingly difficult, right, to get to do.
Yeah, because you're not doing it for the job security, and most of the time you're not doing it for the paycheck.
100%, right? And so there is a sense, when you are in leadership positions, that you are letting people down if you walk away from those positions, right? And those jobs often break your heart. I think one of the reasons I was really struggling towards the end is I remember saying to someone, I don't think I had a year in the last 5 years I was working in a newsroom where I didn't have to lay people off. Ugh. And that is much worse for the people who are being laid off. But if you are a human being who is like, functioning on some level, it feels terrible to do that to other people. Like, it is really, sort of like this horrible thing where you are, making decisions that you don't really have control over, right? It's not like I decide when to lay people off. It's like somebody tells me, some business suit gets in a meeting with me and says a bunch of patronizing things and then is like, go fire people. Yep. And that is a horrible experience, right? And it takes a toll on you. But at the same time, walking away from that at a time when we need like journalism and good leaders more than ever does feel, sometimes like, oh, well, maybe that's not the right decision to be making. But, I kind of have had this winding career where I genuinely believe things sort of find me at the right time. So I kind of trust that, like, if I am useful or needed in that space, it will sort of find me again. But that it doesn't have to be what I pursue, so that I can feel good about putting it on my LinkedIn, like it just has to be about something deeper. It has to feel a bit more like a calling rather than just like a job, I think. And I should acknowledge, like, that's a luxury, that's a luxury I have, that I can make those kinds of decisions at this point in my career. Like, for a long time, like I said, I just made decisions because I needed to pay my rent, and like being in a position where I'm a little more solid, I'm a little older, I have the ability to like make difficult choices. That feels lucky, honestly. Like, I feel lucky to be in a position to decide what projects I take. Like, I don't underestimate how many people don't have that kind of opportunity. So I want to acknowledge that because, I also like made different choices. I don't have kids to put through college. I don't, so it's like every choice sort of comes with some responsibility. And so I get to make this choice now, but who knows, like I have never been one of those people who had like a 5-year plan, so
yeah, me neither.
in a year we'll run into each other and I'll be like, yeah, I took a job, who knows.
You want this life? Those choices are necessary.
But what if this isn't what I want? I mean, what if I don't want to live the way you live?
Oh, don't be ridiculous, Andrea. Everybody wants this. Everybody wants to be us.
Among so many iconic statements and lines in The Devil Wears Prada, there is, Andy in the car with Miranda in Paris, the fateful moment where she's like, I don't, what if I don't want this life? And she's like, don't be foolish, which Andrea, always calls her Andrea.
Yeah. Don't be ridiculous, Andrea. Everybody wants what we have.
Yeah. Everybody wants to be us. And then she gets out and
us.
it's that, again, one of, I think, the great shots of Meryl's career where she gets out, does that amazing application of her sunglasses, gets out of the car and wades into the sea of photographers. And Andy opts out of that life in that moment.
Yeah.
But I think watching that at the time that this movie came out, that statement of everyone wants to be us was kind of like a nod along. Yep.
Yeah.
There was,
I mean,
I think there was an easier mass cultural agreement with what she walked into was the era of cribs and the era of celebrity blogs still existed kind of in this time that this woman would have been serving Anna Wintour, and this sort of at any cost presentation of the lifestyle of the rich and famous that resulted in Paris Hilton being and Britney Spears being chased through the streets of Los Angeles by photographers kind of thing. Where do you think in the development of the cultural hierarchy and set of values, particularly in a COVID post-lockdown landscape, how much mileage do you think that statement of everyone wants to be us gets now? Is that totally tone deaf now, or is it still the facade of her at least is sort of the American dream?
It's so interesting because when you see it in the movie, right, you're supposed to reject it. The idea is that Andy rejects it. But when you watch it now, at least for me, I think, well, you rejected it here, but let me know in 20 years what you're doing, because you're going to go work in some other newsroom. Eventually, you're going to rise up through the ranks, and then you're just going to be a version of this. So, are you totally rejecting it? Not totally. Yeah. You're just rejecting this particular part of it, right? So there's that aspect of it. But whether or not people really still want that, I think almost there's more of a want of that, right? Because we've seen the rise of influencer culture. We see how a lot of people don't become journalists anymore. Now they become news influencers. I think there's the Kardashian influencer impact. And that is that people really want to be public facing. They want to have these sort of big public lives. And to me, that's actually the least appealing part of Miranda's life. Having a public life to me feels really vulnerable, right? There's that scene where she's talking about how she's getting divorced again and how people are going to write about her. To me, that is just the worst possible scenario, that you're going through some really private pain and then people are speculating about it. Yeah. But so many people live on camera now, right? So many people do want that. And that's sort of one of the things we posit in that episode about how sort of this generation of women became girl bosses, partially because those movies didn't say to them, this isn't what you should want. They said to them, this is exactly what you should want. Yeah. And they kind of modeled themselves on being these demanding, difficult bosses because they felt like that's what it meant to be a success. So I don't know. I think more than ever, people really want things that they don't understand. They don't understand the cost of them. We've been working on an episode about Madonna, and I actually watched this old Larry King interview with her last night, and he asked her if she enjoyed being famous. Yeah. And she was like, I do enjoy being famous, but and when you want to be famous, you don't know what it's going to cost you. You don't understand the sacrifices you'll make to be famous. You just want to be famous. But then when you're on the other side of it, you're like, oh, this comes with a cost. And I think that's always going to be true. There are always going to be people who want things without sort of understanding the cost. That is what dreaming is to some degree, right? Like that is, we all want things we think will make us happy or will be the thing that finally like solves all our problems. But, you know, in the end, sometimes the things you want aren't what you hope they will be. And that's good and bad. It's not like Madonna said in this, like, oh, and I wish I wasn't famous. She was like, I'm really happy with how things turned out, but I definitely didn't understand what I was sacrificing to get here to some degree. And that's, I think, all of our stories, especially as women.
I don't know how we can go out on a better bow around the package than that. So I think that is got to be our concluding note. Susie, thank you so much for bringing this totem of pop culture to our podcasting doorstep today. It has been so much fun to go journalist to journalist to talk about this movie with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I have really loved having this conversation with you. I feel like I've sort of had a therapy session, so I love it.
Honestly, that is my unstated goal in every single episode. So I thank you for coming and bringing yourself to the table with that today. I thank you so much for your time, Susie. Thank you so much to Susie Banikarim. You can check out her podcast, In Retrospect, which she co-hosts with New York Times editor Jessica Bennett, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, one more quick thing before I go about the Max Fun Drive. That's this week's one quick thing. There are several cool thank you gifts. You guys, we've got presents for you. If you join, it's not just a handshake. We have gifts. There are several cool gifts that you can check out when you head to MaximumFun.org, and you can only get them for these 2 weeks of Max Fun Drive. That is why it is the best time to subscribe. Get the most out of your subscription. One of those is a cool collectible pin representing our show. It's cool. It says Feeling Seen. It's got it's yellow and it's red, and it kind of looks like it's very action-y. Part of the brand of Feeling Seen is my passion for action cinema, and however I can insert that into a conversation. So we're sort of evoking 80s action movies with the pin. It's very cool. Go get it. And you can see it on our social media accounts or when you go to MaximumFun.org to join or upgrade your membership. There are also some stretch goals. I mentioned early. Stick around. We've got more details for you. If 50 Feeling Seen listeners join or upgrade, we will do another poster giveaway from my collection. And because we started doing this last year, we have started creating a collection just for this giveaway. So we've been amassing posters this year, and you can get one of them if you do one of those things, if you join or upgrade. And so come on board. We want to see you. If 100 Feeling listeners join or upgrade, that is when we will make our erotic thriller bonus content into a series. So truly my self-worth, my sense of value, it's hinging on you all joining, because if you don't, then I'm like, oh my God, they don't want what I do. They don't want what I do if I don't hit 100 listeners. I've given them this option. Exercise this option. Support me, support us, support Maximum Fun. And thank you to anyone who has already done so. MaximumFun.org/join. And that is our show. You made it, I made it, we made it together. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at FeelingSeenPod, or send us an email at feelingseen@MaximumFun.org. If you want to follow me, I am Jorcru on Twitter. It's JORCRU. Our theme music is by Andrew Epen. The show is produced by Marissa Flaxbart. Our senior producers are Kevin Ferguson and Laura Swisher, and this is a production of Maximum Fun.
Maximum Fun,
a worker-owned network
of artist-owned shows.
supported
Directly
by you.